Hello everyone, you're listening to The Right Side of Gaming. Today we're going to be going over some of the spells in Magic Legends and their paper counterparts. To do this, we're actually going to be using Gatherer, which I'm a big fan of. I use it a lot whenever I'm building an EDH deck or something. It lets you search through cards pretty well, and they have a really nice advanced feature that'll let you go through and narrow it down to pretty much anything you're looking for. And then we're going to be using the MLARPG.com. Alright, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at cards by name. So if it's a spell in Magic Legends, that is also a spell in Magic the Gathering. We're just going to go in and look at the effects, the mana costs, and just see how well they match up. We've got about 24 of these today, and that seems like a low number. It is compared to the full extent of the cards that they have in Magic Legends so far. There's a lot of cards that don't have a paper counterpart, and there's a lot of cards that we don't know the effect for yet. But these are ones where we do know both what they do in the video game, at least as we've seen them so far. I mean, there's always potential that they've changed sometime between the last preview and actual release. But we know what they do, and they have a paper counterpart. So, our first card is Bathe in Dragonfire. It's a converted mana cost 3 card that costs 2 and a red. A sorcery that deals 4 damage to a target creature. So it's just a straight up generic damage spell. In Magic Legends, they've increased the cost to 8, so it's more than doubled. It's 5 and 3 red. And instead of just doing damage to a creature, it creates a line of damage, and then a hazard that does damage over time. Now this is one where I think maybe they changed it up. One, to add in some more varied effects. So you don't really get area of effect damage in a trading card game. 2, it lets you get some more high value cards in there, especially with direct damage. And 3, it plays a little bit like you would expect in Dragonfire and say D&D. You have that big fire damage and that big AoE, so it sort of fits in the theme with one of their other properties. It's thematic, and I guess it sort of fills a specific niche. So I'm not going to give them too much flack for this one. Next, we have Concentrate. The straightforward 4 mana spell, 2 and 2 blue, that draws you 3 cards. And while we have the handy little picture, they don't have the description in here yet, but we do have the preview, and it's draw 3 spells. So it's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to draw you 3 spells, replenish your hand, and it costs 2 and 2 blues. That is an absolute direct translation, and it's one that fits in well. If you're playing a lot of low mana cards or something like that, and you need to replenish your hand, this will be the last card you have in your hand most likely, and it'll more or less fill it up. You'll have 3 of your 4 cards back. So I think that's a good inclusion, and one that was done faithfully. Next we have Dominate. Oh, one too far. There we go. Next we have Dominate, which is 1 and 2 blue, and then it has X. And if you're not familiar with X in the card game, that is a variable cost. You can pay whatever you want for X. You can pay 0. Sometimes you have to, depending on how the card is played. Or you can pay like 1 or more. In this case, you gain control of target creature with a converted mana cost of X or less. So if you pay 5, you should bring it up to a total of 6 generic mana, 2 blue mana, so that'd be 8 mana. You could take control of a creature with a mana cost of 5 or less. Dominate in the game, then you'll notice, has a mana cost of 1 and 3 blue. So basically they dropped that X and turned it into another blue mana, presumably because it would be a pain to do X in the game, although we'll see an example of X later, so I think it's one of those where they're just trying to reduce the number of X cost cards. But you take control of target creature for 15 seconds. So that's a pretty decent amount in an action RPG, but it's not going to be permanent. So basically they've made it where you dropped that variable cost and just changed it to a straight blue. Instead of getting a card permanently but having to pay a lot more, you're just getting a card temporarily. And I've seen cards that do something similar in red in the actual card game for 1 less mana, so this doesn't really seem all that different. Like that would be well in line with something in the actual card game, and it still, I think, fits the actual physical card. They've just made it a little bit easier to implement in the video game. Next, we have Dredge Skeletons, a 2-mana creature that has Regenerate. And if we look at the card in Magic Legends, it is a 2-mana creature with Regenerate. So you didn't really have to do anything fancy there. It is another just straight translation over into the game, so I can appreciate that. Next, we have Earth Elemental. It's a 5-mana cost card for 3 and 2 red, and it's just a vanilla creature. And if you're not familiar, vanilla just means it has no specific effect. It's just creature, power, toughness. We have flavor text, but that doesn't really affect anything in the game. It's just no effect. In Magic Legends, it is a 4-mana card, so they've dropped the cost a little bit for 2 and 2 red. And when you summon it, it taunts enemies, and it'll deal damage to, I guess, everyone in front of it. So I think they're trying not to do too many vanilla creatures, especially if it's getting a little bit higher in cost. Honestly, that's a trade-off I don't particularly mind. In this case, it's a little cheaper, and it has an effect. I feel like no one's really going to complain too much about that. Next, we have Enormous Bailoth. It's a 7-mana creature for 6 and 1 green, and it's another one of those vanilla creatures. So chances are they're going to add an effect to it, and they did. So they increased the cost, so it's a 10-mana creature, 8 and 2 green, which is a lot of mana. I mean, you get 12 in the game in Magic Legends. Now, that may not be a whole lot in some Magic the Gathering formats, but in Magic Legends, that's most of your mana. But on top of that, you get, on summon, it deals damage and knocks down nearby foes. So it does have, a little bit in there to justify the extra cost. And honestly, because it's Magic Legends, because you have that auto-generating mana, not as bad that it's a high-cost card, although it will keep you from playing another decently costed card for a while. Next, we have Fiendslayer Paladin. It has First Strike, which means it will do damage to enemies before they have a chance to damage it, unless they also have First Strike or Double Strike. It has Lifelink, so it would gain life back whenever it deals damage. And it has Protection. Well, not Protection. It can't be targeted by black or red spells your opponents control. So in here, it's the same mana cost. It's 1 and 2 white. And instead of having First Strike, Lifelink, and Protection, it just charges forward and does damage. I can see how you can translate First Strike into that. It's not necessarily a permanent First Strike. It's just you summon it, it does damage real quick before they can do damage back. I think it's a little faithful. I mean, they left out a bit, but you can only put so much on one of these summon spells. And I guess they decided, okay, it doesn't need lifelink or protection. We have Flame Tongue Kavu, which is 3 and a red, and whenever it enters the battlefield, it does damage to a target creature. In here, it's actually a little cheaper. It's a 1 and 2 red. If it was a physical card, I'd say it's not as easy to splash into non-red decks or multicolored decks because of the extra mana symbol. I don't think that matters as much in Magic Legends. But they did change up the mana cost. And whenever you have it attack or summon it, it's going to deal damage to foes in a line over 2 seconds. So it's still going to do some of that direct damage, and it's a little cheaper. I think that one is probably in line with the original card. Next we have Giant Growth. It is 1 green, just a single green, 1 mana cost card. and it increases a creature by 3/3 until the end of turn. In Magic Legends, they've increased the cost a little bit, so it's 2 green. It's green, but it's still going to give one of your creatures +3/+3. It's going to give a specific creature +3/+3, the one with the highest combined power and toughness. But again, it's temporary and it's exactly +3/+3. So I feel like that's in line with the actual card. I think the 2 green cost and the fact that we don't really have turns, they have to give it a specific duration, is kind of part of game balance. But otherwise, I think it's fairly faithful to the original card. Next, we have Goblin Warchief. Goblin spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, so it makes goblins cheaper to play. And goblins you control have haste. So we talk about lords in Magic the Gathering, where they give your other creatures a bonus. Oftentimes it'll be something really generic, like they might give you an ability like haste, they might reduce the cost, they might give you a bonus to attack or toughness or both, but this is that type of card. And in the game, you notice this is going to be a little bit more expensive. In Magic the Gathering, it is a 3 mana card, 1 and 2 red. In Magic Legends, it's 4 and a red, so it got a bit more expensive. And instead of making your goblins cheaper to cast, it's giving them a bonus to attack. But it also gives them greater swiftness, which I translate to as haste. So instead of making them cheaper, you're giving them a small attack buff. While it's not exactly the same as Goblin Warchief, it's pretty in line with both part of the effect and the spirit of the card, of the goblin being a lord, a creature that buffs up your other goblins. It is more expensive, so I'm going to say it's not entirely in line with the original card, but it's close enough that you can see that they're getting some of the flavor at least. Next we have Mass Manipulation. It's 2X and 4 blue. And you're going to gain control of X target creatures and or planeswalkers. Probably not going to be controlling other planeswalkers in this game, but you can get at least X number of target creatures. And to make it clear, if I wanted to gain control of 2 creatures, I would have to pay 2 for X twice. So that would be 4 mana plus 4 blue. So 2 creatures would cost 8 mana. In the game, we kept the XX, and then it only costs 2 blue instead of 4. Because you can see how with that 2X, that can pile up over 12 pretty easily. And here, I think you can get up to X equals 5. So it would be 5 plus 5 generic mana for 10, and 2 blue. So that would be 12 mana, which is the most you're going to have in the game, unless there's some way to somehow get more than your maximum mana. You're going to take control of enemy creatures in an area around you for 10 seconds. So this is temporary compared to a permanent control, which is in line, I think, with ARPG game balance. They don't want you to permanently take control of all these creatures. And instead of targeting specific creatures or a specific number of creatures, it's everything within a certain radius, and that increases by how much mana you spend. So I think it's in line with the spirit of the original card. They just had to rebalance it a little bit for effect and how it would work in the game. But I think I'm going to give this one to him. Next, we have Nema Silt Lurker. It is a 5 mana, 4 and a green, vanilla creature. Nothing really special going on there, so I suspect they're going to add an effect. And it looks like they did. So it's cost 3 and 2 green, so it's still a 5 mana creature. They just made it where you have to use a little bit more green mana to cast it. And it has an ability that does damage to foes over time and applies a taunt and lesser weakness to each foe. So it's going to be one of those where you get a creature that's about the same as the original, but you get an added effect on top of it, which I'm not going to complain about. Next, we have Nourish. It is a green card, a 2 converted mana cost that just straight up regains you life. You gain 6 life. In Magic Legends, we've increased the mana cost by 1. So instead of green, it costs 1 and 2 green. And it's going to heal you and nearby players just right off the bat. And then it's going to give you and those players a heal over time, a hot. So I think that's how we're handling life gain. Life gain is just going to be a straight up heal. This is basically saying you gain 6 life, but also your allies gain life, and you're also getting a heal over time on top of that. Now, the initial heal may not be equivalent to 6 life. It may not be 6/20ths of your total health or whatever, but I think it's still in line with the actual card. It's going to be a healing card, and it's going to heal both you and your allies. So I think it's more just game balance than anything else. It's one of your heals in green, and I think we can give this one to them. I think they did a pretty good job of translating it over into video game terms, which isn't necessarily going to be exactly the same for healing as Magic the Gathering paper terms. Next, we have Open the Graves, a card I am personally rather fond of. For 5 mana, it's an enchantment that's costs 3 and 2 black, and whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you get a zombie token. In Magic Legends, they've increased the cost, so instead of a 5 mana enchantment, it is a 6 mana enchantment. So it's 4 and 2 black instead of 3 and 2 black. But the effect is the same. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you get a zombie token. I realize that they do have to balance things slightly different in Magic Legends, and they might have to in the paper game, so I'm not going to fault them too much for the 1 extra mana. I think I'm going to give this to them as a pretty faithful translation. Next, we have Rampant Growth. It is a sorcery that costs 1 and a green, so 2 converted mana cost. You search your library for a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped, so it is a ramp card. It's one of those where it gives you more mana faster. We don't necessarily have land cards in our spell deck in Magic Legends, so we do have to ramp a little bit differently. This costs 2 green, so it's still the same mana cost. It's just going to be both green instead of 1 generic and a green. And you have greater mana regen. So that's going to be how they're handling mana ramp. You're just going to regenerate it faster rather than somehow getting a bigger mana bar, which I think makes more sense. That's more in line with RPG terms than paper Magic. So I think I'm going to give this one to them. I think they translated it over really well and pretty much directly, except they put it in video game terms rather than Magic the Gathering terms. Next, this one, I don't think they really pulled this card. They just happen to use the same name. Revenge in Magic the Gathering is part of a dual face card that says you double your life total and your opponent loses half their life rounded up. So it's going to heal you and damage your opponent for 6 mana. It's going to be a white-black card. In Magic Legends, it is a 4 mana card, so it's cheaper. It's 3 white, so there's no black cost in there whatsoever. And it's just going to deal damage and an AoE. And it's going to do double damage if you're at lower health. So I think this is one of those where they borrowed the name, but they didn't necessarily base it off of the actual Magic the Gathering card of the same name. Not really a whole lot of direct damage in white to work with. At least not that doesn't rely on someone attacking or defending or something like that. So I think this is just one of those cases where they needed something that seemed white to sort of fit in one of those gaps that you need, specific effects for a video game that don't necessarily have a correlation to the card game because, you have a separate color pie in Magic the Gathering, whereas you have different needs for everyone in a video game. So this isn't necessarily a translation of the card, it's just one of those I think they needed to fit something in. Next we have Scathe Zombies. It's pretty much a generic card, vanilla creature. Cost 3 mana, 2 and a black. And in Magic Legends, they've increased the cost. It's 2 and 2 black, so it's a 4 mana card. But it summons 3 zombies, which I think is a fairly faithful translation. They've increased the cost, but you get extra zombies, and that extra zombie body, whatever, even if the total damage winds up being the same as if it was all put on one creature. We have a lot of effects that happen when creatures die, so making it a little bit more expensive but giving you 3 would make sense in terms of video game balance. So I think I'm going to let them have this one. Next we have Sleep. It taps creatures a target player controls, and they don't untap during their next untap step. So it makes it where those creatures can't attack or use certain abilities. So it's just sort of a control effect in the card game. For 4 mana, 2 and 2 blue. In Magic Legends, it's the exact same cost, 2 and 2 blue. But since it's a video game, you don't really have creatures tapping so much. So it disorients foes. We don't really know what disorient means, but I think we can take it as, for a period of time, they are going to be under a control effect where they probably won't be able to attack or something. So I think that is a faithful translation. It's the same cost. It's a video gameized version of the effect. So I think I'm going to give that one to them. Next we have Sporecaps Spider, which is 2 and a green. So it's a converted mana cost 3 card. It's fairly vanilla, except it has reach, which lets it block and do battle with creatures that are flying. In Magic Legends, same cost, it's 2 and a green. But instead of reach, which I guess doesn't necessarily have a great translation into video games, unless it's being able to attack something that's flying, well, it has a projectile, so I think it would let it do that. If there's something flying, it can still hit it. And it's going to do damage over time, and it's going to apply the stun effect. So other than reach, it's kind of generic vanilla. So naturally, I understand them giving it a effect of some kind. So having that stun, I think, works. And I think we can treat projectile as reach, being able to hit things from afar or flying or whatever. So I think this is a pretty good translation of the card into the video game. So I'm going to let them have that one. I think that's a good job. Next, we have Stampede. All attacking creatures get +1/+0 and gain trample until the end of turn. It's for 3 mana, 1 and 2 green. In Magic Legends, it costs 6 mana, so they've doubled the cost. They made it a little easier to cast. I mean, it's not like you have 2 mana and 4 green. It's 5 and 1 green. And it just deals damage over time. I think this is one of those where they borrowed the card, but they had it fit an effect that they didn't normally have otherwise. You don't get a lot of direct damage in green. Sometimes you'll get like fight effects where you have one of your creatures do damage to another creature, but that is just something that's going to be happening normally in a video game. So they wanted, I think, a green damage card, a green damage sorcery. So they borrowed this, and honestly, having a bunch of damage over time does seem kind of like a stampede. Everything's just sort of like running through or over you or whatever. So it still fits flavor-wise. So not exactly the same, but I can see what they were going for there. Next, we have Tidal Wave. It's 2 and a blue, so a mana cost 3 card. That creates a blue wall token that you sacrifice at the end of your turn. So it's basically a surprise creature. In Magic Legends, it's a 5-cost card, so they've bumped up the cost. And instead of creating a wall that just protects you for a turn, it does damage in an AoE, then applies a snare, and it does additional damage, I guess. So I think this is one of those, again, where they didn't necessarily have a whole lot of direct damage in blue, and they needed to fit that into the actual video game. Tidal Wave, I mean, blue does a lot of stuff with water and wind, so this seemed thematically appropriate. I think it's one of those where they're not necessarily basing it off the card, but just sort of, this is a blue sounding name and effect. This is going to be a it's going to be a similar example. This is Tornado. This is a green card, 4 and a green, and I want you to remember that. It's going to be very important. Remember, Tornado in Magic the Gathering is a green card. It's an enchantment with a cumulative upkeep, so you have to keep paying to keep it in play. It's a sort of roundabout way to destroy things. In Magic Legends, it's a blue card instead of green. So instead of a 5 mana green card, we have a 5 mana blue card, 3 and 2 blue. It's going to create a hazard that pulls foes in and does damage over time. So this takes a little setup to do damage, destroy things. This one, I think, it gets a little bit of that flavor. Does a little bit of a setup and does damage over time. So it takes a little while to destroy things, but it destroys things. Again, I think this is one of those where I don't want to say it's entirely where they borrowed the name, because the mana cost is similar. The effect, outside of the cumulative upkeep part, is kind of similar, but it's a completely different color. So I'm going to let you guys make up your mind as to whether or not you think this is based on the actual Magic the Gathering card, if they came up with it themselves, or if it's maybe somewhere in the middle, like a mix of both. Next we have Vicious Hunger, a 2 mana, black and black sorcery that does damage to a creature and you gain life. In Magic Legends, we have Vicious Hunger. It's a 3 mana card, so they've increased the cost, 1 and 2 black. But it's going to do damage to a foe and heal you. So I think that's a pretty faithful translation. Again, they increase the cost, but I understand how they need to do that a little bit for balance. But otherwise, I'm dealing a certain amount of damage to you and I'm gaining that life back. I think that's a pretty good translation. Finally, we have Water Elementals. It's a 5 mana card, 3 and 2 blue. It's another one of those vanilla creatures. It has no particular effect or anything, so they're probably going to give it 1. And we have Magic Legends, Water Elemental, 3 and 2 blue, so same cost. And they gave an effect. Whenever you summon it, it's going to pull enemies toward it and knock them down. So it's not like you're having to pay a bunch for a generic vanilla creature. It is the same cost with an added effect. We're not complaining about those. It's nice to have something that your card does instead of it just being a vanilla creature, especially when you get into higher converted mana costs. So again, no complaints here. I think this is a good translation of the card. And that's all of them that we have for today. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you'd like to leave a comment, like, subscribe, that'd be great. If not, that's okay too. Either way, I will catch you next time and hope you have an awesome day.